Detroit did not just fall apart, it got hollowed out block by block until the streets started writing their own rules. And when the city turns into that kind of pressure cooker, the hustlers stop moving like random corner boys. They start moving like a system. That is where Young Boys Inc. steps in, not as a rumor, but as a real machine built out of the projects, run with business thinking, and protected by fear. Kids become workers, corners become outlets, and the name turns into a brand people respect and fear at the same time. Then the heat comes. Raids, indictments, bodies, and a paper trail that keeps stacking for decades. And here's the part that makes this story hit different. When they finally said YBI was decimated, the echo did not stop. So what actually happened when the heat peaked and the real power stopped looking like one man? Detroit has always been a city that talks to itself through slogans, little mottos people throw up like personal billboards, trying to make a hurting place feel alive again. But one question never stopped hanging in the air. What really happened here? And why did the city not bounce back? There is no clean answer that fits in a neat box. The riot did not create the pain. It ripped off the cover and exposed an invisible society, the forgotten underclass that had already been there. That mood matters because it explains why the streets started building their own economy, their own rules, and their own heroes. And once a city gets to that point, it stops being about a few bad guys. It becomes about an environment that is ready for a crew like Young Boys Inc. to step in and take over. Before YBI, most Detroit crews moved like old organized crime. In that world, a crew did not just sell dope, they protected the name. Loyalty was the whole religion. But Detroit was changing fast, and the streets were about to reward something colder than loyalty. They were going to reward crews that knew how to move smart, stay out of cuffs, and keep the business running even when the heat got loud. That shift is important. It is the difference between gangs trying to look tough and gangs learning how to operate. A few years after the riots, heroin started showing up in Detroit. It did not hit like it did in places like Harlem and Newark, where it picked up steam around 1966. Detroit treated it like an oddity until 1970. Then Henry Marzette stepped into the picture as a top dog in the city's drug trade. Marzette was a black former Detroit cop who was allegedly jailed during the 1950s on corruption charges. After prison, he was feared as a guerrilla pimp, the kind who recruits prostitutes from other pimps by force. But the big pivot came when he noticed the profits the mafia was making from heroin in New York. He decided to get in on the action. Between 1969 and 1970, he took over the trade from a mob family in Detroit and became the city's biggest heroin financier. And here is the part that should make you pause. During his reign, there was little or no press coverage in the Free Press or the Detroit News. That silence matters. When a city ignores the monster grows in the dark. Then Marzette died in the early 1970s, but heroin did not die with him. It kept ravaging Detroit. Crime surged as addicts fed their monsters. Detroit's car theft rate became the highest in the nation. Homeowners spent tens of thousands turning houses into iron-barred fortresses. The city felt like a trap where everybody was either running from something or chasing something. Then 1975 hit, and the street scene got louder. Gangs like the BKs, Black Killers, and the Errol Flynns appeared. The Errol Flynns became infamous during an average white band concert where they went on a raping and robbing spree. That same year, the city felt so volatile that Motown, the soul of Black Detroit, moved to Los Angeles. Nelson George, who wrote the Motown history Where Did Our Love Go, said, "I hate to say it, but during that time, Detroit wasn't conducive for a booming black business." That line lands hard. When culture leaves and jobs are already slipping, the streets do not stay empty. Something else fills the space. Right before YBI rose, a more traditional crew still held real weight in Detroit's drug market. Murder Row started in 1974 as a subset of the Italian Mafia in Detroit. One of its founders, Francis "Big Frank Nitti" Usher, had a close relationship with Anthony "Tony Jack" Giacalone, the leader of the Detroit Mafia. The Mafia usually looked down on black gangs, but with Tony Jack and Big Frank Nitti, there was a real mentorship vibe. Because of that bond, the Mafia supplied Murder Row's drugs. But in 1975, their main enforcer, Campbell, got arrested, and that was the crack in the wall. They lost their grip fast, and when a crew like that slips, it leaves a gap in the streets. Somebody always runs through that gap. That is how the city kept moving. The next wave of gangs stopped putting loyalty first. They started putting survival first. The new focus was not family structure, it was how to avoid police and stay in motion. The streets were getting more tactical, more business-minded, and more ruthless. By the late 1970s, Detroit had street gangs with their own identity and flash. The Errol Flynns were founded on the Lower East Side. They used gangsta jets, hand signs, to show membership in public. That kind of signaling even spread through parties. In that era, house parties could be identified by gang affiliation through dances people did, even if they were not officially in the gang. The city was also dealing. With racial and economic unrest as people and money left for the suburbs, the community got fractured and poorer. As the murder rate soared, Detroit's reputation got darker. Gangs started seizing territories. The Errol Flynns pulled youth in because they took pride in appearance and style. In a city full of decay, that lifestyle felt attractive. The Errol Flynns became wealthy and dominated rackets like extortion, robbery, and drug trafficking, and they were linked to mass robberies. The gang grew to almost 400 members, but that level of attention always comes with a price. Once you get that kind of spotlight, the streets start asking who is next to rise and who is next to fall. And while all that was happening on the ground, the feds were already in Detroit looking for big fish. La Cosa Nostra activity brought more federal law enforcement into the city. Detroit's La Cosa Nostra, known as the Detroit Partnership or Taco Zerilli family, stayed powerful through traditional rackets like loan sharking and illegal gambling, especially sports and horse betting. They were also tied to distribution in the growing heroin trade. That is the pressure cooker, a city split between East Side and West Side, with both sides holding most of the people and most of the street life. A city known for producing kingpins, hustlers, and entrepreneurs, summed up by that saying, if you can make it here, then you can make it anywhere. Before the 1970s, the Italian mob had the most control, from Prohibition days into the height of the heroin trade. But between the 1970s and the 2000s, a new era came in. The ghetto streets produced crews and names like Young Boys Incorporated, Pony Down, Cash Flow Posse, Dog Pound, and more. And the explosion only got bigger when the drug got meaner and the money got louder. Crack cocaine hit Detroit like a bomb, destroying families, straining law enforcement, and shifting everything in culture and the justice system. The crack explosion spawned millionaire kingpins and violent turf wars, along with countless smaller dealers and addicts. The fallout did not fade away. Families in the system were still dealing with it. In that same era, the Chambers Brothers became a major crack organization in Detroit. They were a different type of crew, not just flashy, but controlled, not just wild, but organized. And around that same broader timeline, the Black Mafia family was founded in 1985 in Southwest Detroit by Demetrius Big Meech Flannery and Terry Southwest T. Flannery. They later built major cocaine distribution reach through hubs like Atlanta and Los Angeles, and even stepped into music later as BMF Entertainment. So by this stage, Detroit is not dealing with one crew running one corner. It is multiple empires moving at once. Different crews, different styles, same city, same hunger. The city was already cracked open. Drugs were turning the streets into markets and markets into war zones. It was the perfect setup for a crew to step out of the projects, move like a business, and turn the whole city into a pipeline. But there was one detail that made this shift even more dangerous. At the time, juveniles got treated soft by local law enforcement. If young kids got picked up, a lot of times they were back out fast and the charges were lighter, if they caught anything at all. On paper, it looked like mercy. On the block, it looked like an opening. It looked like a cheat code. The streets clocked it quick. Kids could move product and take less heat. And once that idea caught on, it stopped being a mistake in the system. It became the system. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Detroit's hustle stopped looking like random street chaos and started looking like a system. You had kids on the block who were not just hanging around anymore. They were moving heroin and other drugs at retail, like it was a real job. The streets stopped seeing youth as a risk. They started seeing youth as a strategy. That is the moment the whole underworld shifts. The old way was changing fast, and the streets started rewarding speed, flexibility, and whoever could move the product without catching heavy time. Once that door opened, it was only a matter of time before one crew stepped through and made the whole city feel different. That crew was Young Boys Incorporated, or YBI. They did not just pop up as another gang. They rewrote the script and made the hustle look like a brand, a lifestyle, and to a lot of young teens, a ladder out. In a twisted way, YBI filled the space Motown used to fill for some people. To street teens, these guys were young superstars, more loved than Michael Jackson and Prince. Even older junkies locked into nostalgia caught the vibe, because YBI wrapped the heroin in coin envelopes, like old 45 RPM singles, a throwback to soul culture. Heroin started feeling like a Stone Soul picnic. That is how deep the cultural grip got. When a crew becomes a symbol, people stop seeing it as straight crime. They start seeing it as a lifestyle, a code, and a way out. And that is when the streets get dangerous, because the brand starts recruiting for itself. You do not even have to force it. Kids volunteer. And once kids volunteer, the machine gets bigger than any single person running it. YBI was officially formed in 1976 on Bernie Elementary School's playground. It started with neighborhood friends in their late teens. Dwayne Davis, also known as Wonderful Wayne, Bernard Boykins, Reginald Chestnut, and Charles Lindsay. Not long after, Mark Block Marshall and Raymond Peoples, known as Baby Ray, joined and quickly became bosses. 2 years later, Milton Butch Jones got paroled from prison, stepped into the organization, rose into boss status, and started his own family. Around that same time, YBI split into 3 crews, one tied to Davis, one tied to Peoples, and one tied to Jones. Their main territory sat around the Dexter and Davison neighborhood on Detroit's northwest side. And once that split happened, the city started seeing something scary. It was not one crew doing everything. It was one brand with multiple engines running at once. And that is when takeover talk starts turning real. What made YBI even wilder is that some of the key names were already known to police before YBI ever got big. Raymond Peoples had already been in the spotlight. In 1975, Peoples was charged with 2 other men for the murder of Marian Pisco, a 54-year-old Polish immigrant who worked as a pan washer in a bakery. She got dragged from her car and beaten with a chunk of broken concrete during a rash of racial disturbances. Peoples went through 3 trials, and during those trials, witnesses started forgetting things at the perfect time. In the end, Peoples walked. Mark Marshall's story was a different kind of dark. He was a brilliant student in school and came from a broken middle-class home. His mother, Mary, worked as a secretary. His father, Wallace, owned a shoe shop. Marshall grew up in Russell Woods on the west side. Later, his father married into the Blount family, tied to Great Lakes Life Insurance Company. Then on August 19, 1974, Marshall's father, stepmother, her mother, and Beatrice Williams, a nurse, were murdered. Marshall got charged with the knife and meat cleaver slaying, and the police report even mentioned sexual evidence on the bodies. After 2 mistrials, all charges were dropped in August 1978. Marshall came out saying, "Justice has been done after 4 years. I'm going up north to fish and think." That line sounds calm, but it also sounds like a reset, and that reset matters because it sits right next to what happened next. Not long after that, Marshall and Peoples began helping build YBI up for real, with the claim that more than $70,000 from Marshall's father's insurance was part of the money behind it. And it did not start with some cartel announcement or big flashy launch. It started on a corner at the northwest street corner of Prairie and Puritan. From there, the tentacles stretched. Detroit first, then several counties. That is why people look back later and get chills. It was not some outside crew invading the city. It was the city producing its own machine right in front of everybody's face. And once it gets moving, the next question becomes simple. How long before it takes over? Everything. About 2 years after formation, YBI had completely taken over the heroin trade in and around Detroit, with sales estimated around $300,000 per day. They controlled about 80% of the heroin traffic in Detroit from the summer of 1978 through 1987. That is not doing well. That is owning the board. After the split, Davis sent a top lieutenant to Boston to expand. About a year later, that crew with new Boston members took over most of Boston's heroin trade too, with sales peaking around $70,000 per day. That is when it becomes clear what YBI really was. Not just a neighborhood gang, not just a Detroit thing. It was a blueprint, and once a blueprint exists, other cities start catching the infection. That is when the feds start watching harder. That is when rivals start getting nervous, and that is when the streets start getting ready for war. By 1981, YBI's workforce was about 300 strong, and it was mostly teens and preteens. The reason it worked is simple and brutal. Kids caught lighter punishment, and the law could not prosecute them the same way as adults. So the young ones took the risk, and the leaders stayed insulated. People said the organization ran like a military outfit with soldiers on corners, lieutenants controlling sections, and an A-team handling enforcement. But it also moved like a corporation. The name Young Boys Incorporated was not an accident. This was a company mindset. Salesmen were told not to use the product. Butch Jones drilled them in marketing meetings with the same message: get high on money. And the rewards were built to keep the kids locked in. Gold and diamond jewelry, goose-down leather jackets with fur-trimmed hoods called Max Julians. In the projects, that kind of flex turns into gravity. It pulls people in. And once kids start believing the hustle is a career path, expansion becomes the natural next move. YBI was also ahead of the game with branding. U.S. Attorney Roy Hayes said it straight. YBI was the first drug organization that I know of to use brand names on their heroin. They had names like CBS, Rolls-Royce, and Coochie Khan. It was a Madison Avenue approach. You can trust our product. That is what made them different. They were selling an identity, not just a high. And when competitors tried copying the style, YBI did not just compete. They sabotaged. They undercut rivals. They even sold low-grade heroin under a competitor's name to mess up that brand's reputation. They also sold $3 plastic packets of crack. and they were bold enough to hand out flyers in the neighborhood listing brand name, price, day, date, and time of sale. That is not corner boy behavior. That is a crew acting like they own the marketplace. And once a crew starts acting like they own it, the city has to decide who is really in control. The movement matched the mindset. Drugs traveled through Mercedes-Benzes, BMWs, taxi cabs, scooters, and 10-speed bikes. Sales areas got patrolled by A-team members riding in Laredo and Wrangler Jeeps, packing Uzis to scare rivals off and hold territory. Later, the Jeeps replaced the luxury cars for distribution because four-wheel drive meant you could deliver in snowstorms and you could dip off-road into brush to shake police. Everything was built for one goal: keep money flowing and keep heat away from the top. That is how they stayed alive for years. The lower you were, the more you touch risk. The higher you were, the more you stayed clean. And that setup is exactly why people still talk about YBI, like it was not just a gang, it was a machine. Butch Jones is a big reason the machine ran smooth. He is one of the founders and the de facto leader who turned the crew into something that moved like business. In his autobiography, he talks about his first murder, saying he was hired to kill another man and unloaded a full clip into him. He talks about poverty and drug sales being the path that pushed him into starting YBI. And he says he wanted an organized crew that could make money more efficiently. He enforced rules hard. He felt untouchable, but he also focused on moving smart, dodging both federal and local law enforcement. He also talks about dealing with Detroit police for years and mentions being afraid of one cop in particular, Rudy Davis. Jones said Sergeant Davis would seize dope, guns, or money and just walked out the door like the shit belonged to him. And Jones even shows a twisted admiration for that corrupt forfeiture style. That detail matters because it shows the world YBI lived in, not just gangs versus cops. Sometimes it was gangs and cops in the same dirty ecosystem. And once that kind of ecosystem exists, the line between power and crime gets blurry fast. But Butch's real power was not just what he did, it was how he set the board so the organization stayed insulated. YBI was structured like a pyramid. At the top were source organization controllers, George Casey and Strata Bush, the invisible bosses controlling money, supply, and direction, nowhere near the corner. Under them were local organization controllers, Milton Jones, Sylvester Murray, and Raymond Peoples, the managers who made the ground game happen. Under them were lieutenants and mid-level bosses supervising crews and enforcing rules, with names like Kurt Napier, Timothy Peoples, Rodney Mason, Edward Jackson, Marlon Green, Gary Goodwin, Ronald Hawkins, Richard Daniels, Kevin Wilson, and Keith Futrell. At the bottom were runners, Fred Coleman, Lewis McLean, Art Sellers, O.C. Bailey, Andre Diggs, Dwayne Locke, Anthony Whitlow, and Alonzo Long, the ones doing the risky street work. Couriers moved drugs and money between levels, so leaders did not have to meet everyone directly. That is insulation. Higher rank meant safer living. Lower rank meant more exposure. And that design is why the machine kept running, even when police started swinging. YBI did not move sloppy. They ran the whole operation like an assembly line. Raw heroin went to a hookup house, where workers mixed it like a factory. The mix got spooned into coin envelopes stamped with brand names like Murder One or Rolls Royce. Envelopes got bundled, then moved early morning to sales spots before the city was fully awake. Each corner or project had a top dog supervising it, and that top dog handed envelopes to runners, usually the youngest because they caught lighter heat. The split was simple. One envelope sold for $13, the organization took $10, and the runner got $3 in tops. Stack enough tops and a kid could make $300 to $400 a day just off the cut. That is why it spread fast and why an 11-year-old carrying $2 grand stopped shocking anyone. Sunday was payday like a real payroll, with rank-based pay plus tops and bonuses popping up often. And the bigger the rewards got, the bigger the question became. Who was keeping this whole thing stocked? When you look at the pyramid, one name jumps out for a reason. YBI could not stay stocked without a major supplier behind the scenes. That is where Sylvester "Seal" Murray stepped in. Murray was the largest black heroin dealer in Michigan and one of the biggest in the Midwest. He supplied drugs to YBI, and by the early 1980s, he had solidified his status as a leading supplier in the Detroit area. He had business skills and catered to crews like YBI and others. He also owned a car dealership and helped provide a chunk of the famous fleet of 16 YBI Chevrolet Corvettes. That is not street money. That is empire money. And when empire money is in the air, you already know what follows. More attention, more pressure, and more violence circling the block. Michigan had dropped the 650 lifer law back in 1973, and it was savage. Get caught with the wrong amount, and you could be looking at life with no parole. Later, they softened the wording to life or any term of years, not less than 20, and in some cases, parole became possible. But the message stayed the same. Michigan was not playing. The crazy part is, it was meant to scare kingpins. Instead, it helped turn YBI into a badge. In Detroit, being tied to young boys, ink started feeling like status. For a lot of black kids, it looked like a fast lane out of poverty. You got teenagers pulling up in brand new cars, getting bonuses like they work at a company. You got dope money so loud a 15-year-old can walk into a suburban Mercedes showroom, point at a black 500 SEL, and say, "I'll take it," then drop $62,000 cash out of brown paper bag. Over in the Jeffries housing project, teens are cruising in new Corvettes and flexing like Christmas is every week. The runners are feeding an estimated 50,000 addicts, and the pay is crazy. Kids as young as 12 are getting pulled in because they can make $2,000 to $5,000 a week. That is why it worked. A 12-year-old in a project, parents out of work, and a guy in a fancy car offers that amount of money. And that is not even a decision. That is a trap dressed like opportunity. Trips are part of the reward system. Kids get taken to Las Vegas to see things they only dreamed about. At one point, 16 Corvettes got handed out for kids to ride around in. But here's the real truth. It was never just money. It was violence holding the whole thing together. The same ecosystem that hands out bonuses also hands out beatings. It comes with warfare, murders, and kidnappings tied to rivalries. That is how these crews keep a market. It is not just supply and demand. It is fear and control. The streets saw a chance. The government saw a monster. And that clash was about to turn into a full-on crackdown. And around that same time, the company started eating itself. In September 1982, the streets say YBI got hit hard inside its own house when Dwayne Davis got taken out over turf. Columbus and Lawton turned into the scene. The story on the ground was that Davis was connected to the H20 crew and was trying to open new outlets for brands like Magic, Uno, Hocus Pocus, and Pac-Man. He even ran a Freak of the Week deal, like a buy one, get one move using a redeemable chit. He and his people rode through in a Jeep Caravan, scouting Lawton Columbus to put down a spot. But Curtis Napier was already posted there, moving young boys P-Funk heroin, and he pressed them about approval. Davis basically said he only had to ask permission from Martindale Street, the base, and Napier was not allowed on Cascade, H20's stronghold. Napier said Columbus Lawton was his. Next day, Davis came back. Shots rang out, his crew scattered, and Davis got left dead. After that, everything turned uglier. Snitches got used. Credibility fights exploded. That is what happens when the same crew that markets like a business starts handling disputes like war. The money stays the goal, but the loyalty gets shaky. That same year, the hammer finally came down. This was the kind of case where everybody got involved. DEA, IRS, Detroit Police, Michigan State Police, all moving like they were trying to tear down a business, not just make arrests. And it was not just arrests and headlines. Houses started getting taken. Big cash started getting seized. Over $1 million in cash was moving through forfeiture. When the government starts grabbing property and money, that is when the block realizes the plug is not forever. That is when the panic hits. The crackdown kept widening. The first wave pulled in dozens of affiliates, and convictions stacked up over the following years. The case was not just kids and dealers either. Corruption got mixed in. A former deputy Wayne County sheriff got hit on racketeering for stealing $2,000 in bail money. A retired Highland Park officer got hit on racketeering and tax charges, and the drug money trail got deep. Sylvester Murray was in the mix as a major target, and in 1983, Detroit police and the DEA seized many of Murray's properties after a heavy investigation that leaned on informants, undercover work, financial digging, transactional tracing, and electronic surveillance. It was not just one agency either. Detroit Police, DEA, IRS, and Michigan State Police were all involved in that push. In that same work, 41 individuals were linked and indicted for narcotics-related offenses, and nearly $2 million in cash and jewelry was discovered. One detail showed the scale in a way people still talk about. Police found $80,000 in a safe that had been sitting for 2 years because Murray forgot the combination. That is the part that makes it feel bigger than a gang. It starts looking like a whole ecosystem. And even after the first big sweep, the story did not stop. It just shifted. The streets kept talking about operations continuing even with prison walls up. The word was that Butch Jones still had motion from behind bars in Texas, with Portia back in Detroit, keeping things moving. A warrant tied to homicides leads officers to Portia's house, and what they find pushes the whole case back open. Then in 1986, Jones gets hit again for continuing involvement in trafficking. That is where it starts to feel like whack-a-mole. You knock one head down, another one pops up. That is how legends survive. not because they are untouchable, but because the structure keeps breathing even when the leaders are locked away. YBI also stayed infamous for making examples. May 30th, 1984 is one of those stories people repeat because it shows how fear got enforced. Ricky Gracie and 3 others try to rob Butch Jones's home. Portia blasts Gracie with a shotgun and the others run. Gracie ends up injured outside, apologizing, asking for water like that is going to save him. Portia calls A-Team Muscle, Charles Obey and Spencer Tracy Holloway, and Andre Williams drives them in. Gracie gets shot 5 times with a .38 automatic. After he gives up names, he gets hit again with an Uzi. Later, his body ends up dumped in an alley. That is not random violence. That is policy. That is a message. And once fear becomes policy, the whole block stops thinking about right and wrong. It becomes safe or dead. While all this is happening, Detroit police start separating unorganized youth groups from gang runners because gang runners move different. They are trained. They get instructions. They work under top dogs. As money rises, being discreet becomes less common with more organized crews. In April 1984, Police Chief William Hart sends a report to Mayor Coleman Young saying they are short on officers and they need to watch youth gatherings tied to drugs and youth crime. He points at spots like Palmer Park, Hart Plaza, and Greektown. Strike Force gets created in 1983, and they brag about 233 arrests in the first 72 hours. By the end of summer, they are up near 600 arrests and detentions. Hart also puts together a youth crime report with scenarios, officer reports on youth groups, and stats to push the point. And the social damage gets heavy too. The link between being a black kid and being seen as criminal gets louder. A joint congressional hearing on narcotics and youth talks about kids as gun-carrying corner protectors and says if you ask an inner-city black youth what he wants to be, do not be surprised if he says a major drug dealer. That is how fear spreads. And once a city starts labeling kids like that, the streets start acting like the label is already written fate. As YBI's leaders start catching time and the original structure takes hits, other crews slide in to grab the space. Pony Down rises in the early 1980s with the Buttram brothers, pulling inspiration from kingpins like YBI. Their base is near West 7 Mile, and they capitalize on the vacuum left by YBI convictions. People say they were making millions a year at their peak, with hundreds of soldiers, workers, and associates under them. And the feds believed Pony Down had more internal issues because they used older runners and were less organized than YBI, which led to more conflict. But the point stays the same. Detroit did not lose the gang economy when YBI got hit. It just swapped out the top brand, and then the setbacks start stacking in a way that looks like the end, at least on paper. In 1982, Mark Marshall goes underground at the height of YBI's prominence. In 1983, Butch Jones gets 12 years. Sylvester Murray also gets 12 years. In August 1985, Raymond Peoples gets found in a car, shot in the back. By 1986, Detroit police, DEA, FBI, and IRS are acting like they finally destroyed YBI. But the streets never see it that clean. Too many people are still free. Too much motion still exists. That is the scary part about a real business. It does not always die. Sometimes the face of the empire just slips into the shadows while the machine keeps breathing. And the next part of this story is where that silence starts feeling louder than the gunshots. By 1987, a lot of people in Detroit wanted to believe the young boy story was done. Like the first big federal wave years earlier had buried it for good. But the paperwork did not line up with that feeling. On July the 21st, 1987, a federal grand jury in Detroit indicted 26 people tied to Young Boys Incorporated. Not like a history lesson, like a crew that was still alive, still connected, and still moving. This case became known as Young Boys 2, and it came with racketeering and tax charges that treated YBI like a real enterprise. The names in it made the point even louder. It reached into the system and pulled in an attorney, a former Wayne County sheriff, and a former Highland Park police officer. And it hit Milton David Jones, Butch Jones, again, put right back in the leader lane. The message was simple. When the feds come back for a second bite, it usually means they found pieces of the machine that were still turning in the dark. And the next name in that indictment is where the whole thing starts feeling deeper than street beef. One name in that 1987 indictment jumped off the page for a different reason. Attorney W. Otis Co Pepper was known locally for defending drug ring figures and murder defendants, so seeing him tied into the same case as YBI was a loud moment. The charge was not that he was out there slanging on a corner. The indictment said he evaded income tax over multiple years and lied to cover income. It also said Co Pepper and Butch Jones conspired to defraud the United States over Co Pepper's taxes. The way it got laid out, the crew was handling legal bills in a street way, not a clean way. The claim was that Jones compensated Co Pepper by purchasing or leasing vehicles and property for Co Pepper's use. then hid those purchases by putting them in other names. One detail hit like a flex that turned into evidence. Back in June 1982, Jones allegedly gave Co Pepper a 1976 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow and put it in the name of Ames Investment Corp. On the street, a Rolls looks like power. In federal court, it looks like a receipt with fingerprints on it. And the indictment did not make it look like a one-time favor. It made it look like a pattern: cash, narcotics, properties, vehicles, and then the hiding game, including claims that Co Pepper lied to his accountant and concealed income connected to those benefits. The vibe was not a lawyer did his job. The vibe was the organization had shields, and those shields were getting paid off the books. And once you see the legal layer getting pulled into the mess, you start asking how many other layers were still plugged in too. The 1987 case also pushed a hard idea that made the city feel paranoid. Prison did not shut Butch Jones down. The indictment described him as serving a 12-year sentence, but still accused him of running young boys after going to prison in 1983. The picture being painted was that the crew did not stop. It adjusted. The claim was that Jones allegedly continued directing activity in Detroit from a prison cell in Texas with help from his wife Portia Jones and other members. That is the kind of detail that makes people feel like the crew is bigger than any one raid. You can lock up a boss, but if the plays still get called, the block still feels the pressure. Prosecutors like Hayes, the late Leonard Gilman, and Gary Felder were framed as coming at YBI like it was a multinational cartel, not a handful of corner hustlers. That matters because it explains why this second wave existed at all. It was the government saying the first takedown did not fully end the enterprise. And the 1987 indictment did not stop at money and structure either. It carried bodies. It carried a violent weight. It charged that various defendants committed 8 murders between 1980 and 1984 while distributing heroin and cocaine. It also alleged Jones, sometimes working with others, murdered 5 competitors, and it alleged Portia Denise Jones participated in 3 killings. That is a cold mix because it ties the street part and the paperwork part together as one system: violence to control competition and financial tricks to hide the money. Jones, his wife, and Detroit attorney James Feaster were also hit with tax violations, like the money side was being treated as a crime lane too, not just an afterthought. Feaster's situation got spelled out in a way that showed how serious the legal side was. He had been sentenced to 5 years in prison after being convicted of tax evasion, obstruction of justice, theft of government property, wire fraud, and advising the preparation of false tax returns. So the picture being painted was not just shooters and sellers. It was an enterprise that used fear on the street and paperwork games in the background. And right in the middle of all that, there was a detail that showed how deadly the environment was for everybody, not just rivals. Officer William Green, a Detroit police officer, was shot and killed in the line of duty. The timeline was tight. At 11:05 p.m., Green and his partner approached a group of teenagers suspected of illegal drug activity in front of the Ambassador Convalescent Center. Both officers were in plainclothes. When they approached to question the group, Green was shot in the head. The suspect was later charged with and convicted of manslaughter. That kind of incident changes the temperature of a whole city. Once an officer dies, the pressure gets heavier, the crackdowns get louder, and whole neighborhoods start getting treated like enemy territory. And that kind of heat forces crews to either fold or adapt. YBI got accused of adapting. Then the case started moving into its next phase. After the July 1987 indictment, the case kept evolving. A superseding indictment came on October 30th, 1987. It charged the same people with RICO, RICO conspiracy, and conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute heroin. That is the system saying, this is not just random crime, this is a crew with structure. Then 7 defendants went to trial on March 9, 1988, for the RICO conspiracy and heroin conspiracy charges. Out of those 7, 5 were convicted. Curtis Napier, Tommy Lee Chatfield, Brenda Harris, and Ralph Jackson were found guilty of RICO conspiracy. Napier and Ray Hernandez were also convicted of heroin conspiracy. Harris received a mistrial on the heroin conspiracy count because of a hung jury. By 1989, the legal fight moved into appeals. The language got technical, but the idea stayed simple. The defendants appealed convictions for RICO conspiracy and narcotics conspiracy. The court affirmed the judgments. Curtis Napier argued the evidence was not enough to convict him of RICO conspiracy because he said the government did not prove an enterprise that was separate from a conspiracy. In plain terms, he tried to say, you're calling a group an organization just because people agreed to do crimes. The government's answer was no, this was bigger than an agreement. This was a structure. The court sided with the government. The reasoning was that RICO conspiracy is about agreeing to participate in the conduct of a criminal enterprise through criminal acts, and that the enterprise has an ongoing organization that exists beyond one single plot. Napier also argued the proof showed multiple conspiracies, like different groups doing different things. The government did not dispute that activity slowed after the first indictment and resumed in 1983 under Butch Jones, but the key point was that multiple conspiracies could still fall under one RICO enterprise. That matters because it meant the court accepted the idea that the young boy system could pause, restart, and still be the same overall machine. And once a court says that, the next thing everybody looks at is the chain of proof. What evidence did they use to say the chain still moved? That is where the details get real gritty. The appeal record showed the kind of evidence used to connect people to the enterprise. Tommy Lee Chatfield was tied to testimony that he supplied guns to Milton and Butch Jones. The detail was wild and specific, shipped by bus, hidden in potato sacks. That is the kind of move that sounds like street thinking, but it lands in court like a pipeline. Ray Hernandez argued there was not enough evidence to link him to the young boys, but testimony described him offering to supply a type of brown heroin called Mexican mud. It also described an arrangement where Jones would pay up front through Western Union. Brenda Harris argued the government did not prove an agreement, but testimony described her home being used to process and package heroin, and that she could be contacted on her beeper for supply if other sources were unavailable. The court treated those fights as credibility issues for a jury, but the bigger takeaway stays the same. The case was built like a chain dot. Even with the boss locked up, the government's whole push was that the chain still moved. And if the chain still moved after the first takedown, then the next part of this story is not about whether YBI ended. It is about what it turned into when it learned how to survive in the dark. By the end of that era, one line sums it up in a cold way. The young boys got hit with a complete decimation. Not a clean ending, not a quick wipeout, more like an ugly dismantling where pieces got torn off one by one until the main body could not stand the same way anymore. But here is the twist. Even after the takedowns, the young boy's name did not turn into a dusty story. It stayed alive in culture. It stayed in conversations. YBI became the subject of hundreds of newspaper articles, dozens of documentaries, and at least 2 published books, YBI, the autobiography of Butch Jones, and Bound by Honor, Torn by Greed, the true and untold story of the Young Boys Inc. That is how you know a crew did more than hustle. They left a model behind. And when a model gets left behind, the streets do what they always do. They copy it. Detroit cartels that came up after that were said to be running off that same structure. Names like Best Friends, Pony Down, Black Mafia Family, and the Chambers Brothers start getting mentioned in that wake. Some even end up appearing together in a BET documentary series titled American Gangster. That is not about giving YBI flowers. That is about showing how long the shadow stayed on the block. Because once the city learns a way to make money, that lesson does not unlearn itself. It just changes uniforms. And one small detail shows how far those ripples traveled. The Boston expansion story did not just sit in a corner of history either. One detail ties that whole idea to later headlines in a way that feels unreal. Stephen Seeley was known for being gunned down while sitting in Whitney Houston's Bentley in front of a Boston club with Bobby Brown in the car. Different city, same pressure, same kind of ending. And while Detroit was trying to move on, one name from the old era refused to stay trapped in the past. Butch Jones did not stay stuck in the 1980s chapter. His name popped back up later in a whole new window with new charges and a new federal hammer. That is where the vanished forever idea gets tricky, because sometimes the boss does not vanish into thin air. Sometimes he vanishes from the old scene, then shows up again in a new one. In a 2008 federal sentencing announcement, Butch Jones was sentenced to 360 months in prison after pleading guilty to federal drug charges involving 2 homicides. The court information said that between 1995 and 2001, he supervised at least 5 individuals in narcotics violations. The case said it involved distribution of at least 5 kilograms of cocaine and quantities of marijuana at locations on the 3700 block of Monterey Street in Detroit. Those locations were referred to as the Dog Pound. And the Dog Pound was not just treated like a spot where people sold drugs. The same locations were described as being used to plan robberies, kidnapping, and intentional killings of rival drug traffickers and their associates. The murders named were Mark Grice and Antoine Carruthers, said to be carried out by at least 2 participants acting in concert with Jones. New era, but the same ingredients: dope, control, violence. The U.S. Attorney Stephen J. Murphy's statement came with a clear message about where this road leads. Drug trafficking is born of greed and begets nothing but violence and more crime. Ringleaders can expect to do substantial stretches of prison time, he said. Another law enforcement voice said the sentence would keep Jones incarcerated well past his 80th birthday, calling him dangerous. The name Butch Jones did not fade out with the old YBI era. It showed up again decades later, attached to new distribution, new violence, and a fresh federal lock. And that sets up the next weird part, because even when the old YBI era is over, the young boy's name still finds a way to crawl back into public talk. In 2017, the young boy's name came back into public talk through a new federal case that prosecutors said echoed the old system. Court records and prosecutors alleged that Daryl Terrell, a former member of Young Boys Inc., returned to drug dealing 35 years after the feds toppled the organization. The allegation was that he built a cocaine empire involving relatives, a grandmotherly drug mule, and a soul food restaurant used to launder money. That restaurant was Cafe Sunshine, near the New Center area. A prosecutor said it looked like a cafe, with a name on it that says Cafe Sunshine, but it did not operate. You could not go to dinner there tonight. You could not go to lunch there tomorrow either. The claim was that the front looked normal, but the back end was money movement. The case described cocaine being imported from Arizona and millions in profits. Then it zoomed in on one tight moment. On October 14th, Cheryl Cheatham, 63, flew from Las Vegas to Detroit Metro, grabbed 2 large suitcases, went to a Westin in Southfield, then got into a hotel shuttle, headed into Detroit. Investigators stopped the shuttle on Southfield Road near Finkel Avenue, and a K9 indicated drugs. The luggage held 17 kilograms of cocaine worth $595,000. From there, the case used phone and travel data to trace the operation. One contact label stood out, Lover Boy, later identified as Jerome Terrell, Daryl's son. Prosecutors said he was escorting the narcotics. They also described Cheatham flying at least 39 times in 18 months, while defense pushed back hard on assuming every trip carried the same amount. Either way, the picture being argued was the same. The Detroit hustle did not disappear, it evolved. And then it got even stranger, because the old name collided with the present again through who was standing in court. That 2017 case took a sharp turn when Otis Co Pepper showed up as Daryl Terrell's lawyer, same Co Pepper tied to the 1987 YBI-linked indictment. He argued the raids found no drugs. Prosecutors said they raided 11 locations and seized more than $1.3 million, $71,000 worth of jewelry, 7 guns, and ammunition. Defense leaned into what was not found. Co Pepper also pushed back on the government linking Terrell to YBI. He said, "There are a lot of us who are still being harangued by the term Young Boys Incorporated. That thing happened 40 years ago." Prosecutors argued the opposite. They argued Terrell's trafficking went back to the 1980s with YBI, and they painted him like a sharp-dressed captain, a boss man, the kind of cat always staying sharp with a nice car and plenty of women. That is the part that makes people feel like the past never fully stayed buried. One former gang member broke it down like a street truth that also sounds like business talk. "The drug business, it's a business. It's just illegal," he said. He explained the heat, the police, the threat of robbers, the rivals, and the feds, saying you have to tiptoe through landmines to make it through. Another voice added the darker idea that some people never really leave that life behind. "Some guys are married to the thuggery," a researcher said, and that is why the young boy's story keeps echoing. The courts say it was dismantled. The streets say the blueprint survived. And once the blueprint survives, the next chapter is always waiting right around the corner, which brings the timeline to the part where the boss looks nothing like the old fear aura anymore, at least on the surface. By 2020, Butch Jones is 65, in a wheelchair, on dialysis 3 times per week, and seeking compassionate release after contracting COVID-19 in federal prison. His attorney argues his health is so bad, it justifies release. The filing says COVID-19 is out of control where he is held, with many positives and deaths at that facility. That is what makes this story feel gritty all the way through. The body gets older, the power fades on the outside, but the paperwork keeps stacking. The name still pulls reactions, and the biggest question gets louder. When a crew is decimated on paper, but keeps echoing for decades, what does that say about where the real power went, and who really disappeared when the heat peaked? That is the part people miss. Detroit crews do not always end. They splinter, they regroup, they go quiet, and the blueprint keeps moving block to block. So when YBI got torn apart, who actually slipped away clean? Was Butch the boss, or just the face out front? Who was really calling shots when the heat got nuclear? What money trail never got found? And if YBI was a machine, who picked up the keys after it stalled? Let us know what you think in the comments box below. And if you liked how we presented you this video, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.